So what really happens when you push your limits in woodworking? Failure, defeat, glory, or something else altogether? Today, we're going to find out. In my previous video, I discussed getting out of my comfort zone and how this project was going to push my abilities as a woodworker. And now that the casework is complete, it's time to start diving into those challenging elements and make some waves. The first step in my road to glory is going to be milling down my material for my fluted drawer fronts. I considered a bunch of different options when it came to accomplishing this task, including utilizing the services of my lumberyard. They have a molding cutting machine that would make quick work of this white oak. However, in sticking with a more hands-on approach, I decided to cut the more decorative details myself. This decision was not just about the end result, but about the learning process and the journey. In hindsight, I probably would have saved myself a few days by going the easy route, but let's be honest, sometimes the easy route isn't always the road we're looking for. So, to hold my fluted sticks in place, I decided to create 2 1/4-inch thick panels. Once I had jointed them over at the bench, I could take those work pieces over to the table saw and rip them down for my oversized panels. When it comes to the fluted piping, my plan is to cut half-round strips one at a time, and I want those half-rounds to create a continuous grain pattern across the front of my drawer faces. So with that in mind, I had to be really careful about tracking each workpiece throughout the process and hope that nothing went wrong. I also had to try to nail the width on all my strips, or once they all came together for the final panel, it would be too wide or too narrow. So there was quite a bit of risk going on in this section of the build, especially because I like to cut all my workpieces oversized and then clean them up with a hand plane. Now normally I like to approach parts knowing I have some sort of fail-safe if everything imploded. This way I could still save some portion of the parts for the project. But in this instance, if at any point there's a catastrophic mistake, then I just have to start over. So fingers and toes crossed. So like I mentioned, I need these parts to be exactly the same width across the entire set, or pretty darn close. So here when I'm planing down the saw marks, I'm counting each of my strokes to make sure they don't go over 2 or 3 per edge. And unfortunately for me, that meant about 52 individual pieces. But sometimes you just gotta work through it. It's like when I walk by a toy store and I see a try me button. I'm never not pushing it. So the next step was to go ahead and create those half-round pieces. And to do that, I'll head over to the router table and use a roundover bit. Now this roundover bit is 3/8 of an inch, or just under half the width of my strips. So once I've cut the profile into both edges, I should have a pretty cylindrical shape. Now my actual workpiece is 7/8 of an inch wide here, so again slightly over double the diameter of the bit, which will result in the fronts having a somewhat flat look. And personally I like that touch because it gives the drawer fronts a little bit more personality and depth. And to assist with cutting those edge profiles, I'm going to use a couple of stock guides to hold my workpieces tight to the tabletop and fence. Then I just made a quick push stick out of some scrap wood to get my fingers out of the way and give me a consistent feed rate. Here I really want to avoid burning on the white oak, so the best way to do that is just to keep the workpiece moving through the cut. In the past I've used featherboards for this type of thing, but I gotta tell you that the stock guides work a lot better since they apply both vertical and lateral pressure to the workpiece, which means I can use a push stick without the featherboards getting in the way. And after about 30 minutes at the router table, I was smitten with the results. From there it was time to go ahead and assemble those 1/4-inch panels. Now I've gone over this a bunch of times in the past, so I'm going to breeze through how to assemble these panels pretty quickly. Since the stock is so thin, a caul is 100% necessary when clamping these up, otherwise you'll end up with a massive bow in the panel. And since we can't use dominoes in a panel this thin, I like to use a couple of F-style clamps on the ends to make sure that those faces stay aligned. From there it was on to the endurance section of the build, and that was to sand down all 52 pieces so that they're nice and smooth for the glue up. Now I'm not going to lie to you, doing this in the middle of the summer definitely had me questioning whether it was a good idea to make all these pieces myself. But I pushed through and persevered, knowing that the upstairs ibuprofen was ready to go that evening. And the shop vac. So with the glue dry on the panels, I could go ahead and square them up over at the table saw. And this is a pretty important step since this is going to be the edge that I reference for all of my piping. So I decided to apply my half-round pieces in a cross-grain orientation. My fear was that running all the piping in the same grain orientation as the panel is that eventually the drawer fronts would curl. So by gluing them in a cross-grain orientation, I can prevent that a bit and add a little stiffness to the drawer fronts at the same time. Now I also contemplated a bunch of different ways on how to adhere the strips to the panel, and I ultimately landed on a combination of CA glue and PVA wood glue. The CA glue should work fine to hold the strips in place, but that added strength of the wood glue will add a bit more security. I also considered tacking them in place from the backside, but ultimately felt that a pin veering off track and causing blowout on the front just wasn't worth the risk. In my mind, being attacked by sawdust is risk enough. So with the glue dry, I could head back over to the table saw and trim down the panels to their final height and width. And I have to say, this might be one of the most satisfying table saw shots that I've had, so enjoy. With the panels satisfyingly cut to their final height, I could carefully trim them down to their final width. Here I took things really slowly so that I didn't accidentally cut into my piping, which explains the serious face. Next, it was time to trim down the drawer fronts for the top and bottom drawer faces. And since I created the drawer front panels as one continuous piece, I really only have to make 2 cuts for each side. So my first cuts are going to be for my top drawer. And here I'm aiming for the reveal or gaps around the drawer faces to be about a 1/16 of an inch. I feel like with this design, the tighter I can make that gap, the better it's going to be for the overall look. So with the top drawers trimmed out, I could go ahead and repeat the process for the bottom ones. From there, I'll head back over to the bench to shim the drawer fronts in place and map out the location for the mounting screws. Here I had to be really careful about the location for those mounting screws because of the way the piping indents into the drawer fronts. Obviously, I really don't want to drive a screw straight through the front of my drawers. So with those measurements noted, I could go ahead and lay them out on the drawer boxes themselves. Then from there, I could drive in a couple of pilot holes so that I can easily reference their location from the inside of the drawer boxes. Now, when it comes to actually mounting the drawer faces themselves, I like to use a combination of CA glue and a couple of clamps. But the first step is to go ahead and drop in some 1/16 of an inch shims onto the bottom of my cabinet. And I like to use 1/16 of an inch shims at the base of the cabinet and 32nd of an inch shims at the center. This way those drawer faces will be super tight and look more continuous. From there, I'll just hold the CA glue in place until it's dry and then apply a couple clamps to make sure that the drawer face doesn't slip down. Next, I'll finish drilling in the pilot holes and then drive in my screws. The last thing to do is just pop off the clamps and the drawer fronts are attached. This is by far the easiest way that I've found to mount drawer fronts when you're not using any hardware. From there, I could go ahead and test out the push to open functionality, and yeah, that's pretty sweet. With the drawer fronts attached, it was time to move on to the cabinet doors. Now, I've built a lot of doors over the years, and I often choose to go with tongue and groove or miter construction. But for this piece, I wanted to do something different. So I instead decided to make the doors using mortise and tenon joinery. And my first step was to head over to the table saw and trim down my stiles and rails to their final dimension. Now, the big reason I'm able to try to do something different with these doors is because I'm going to use cane for the fronts, which is a slightly different process than using panels, but we'll get into that later on. For now, it's time to cut in the mortise and tenon joinery, and for that, I'm going to use the panther router. Now, in the first part of this build, I used the panther router to cut in the variably spaced dovetails for the drawer boxes. But the panther router isn't a one-trick pony, and it does a ton of different joinery techniques. So for this one, I'll just set it up with the mortise and tenon templates and knock them out. Whenever I'm cutting mortise and tenon joinery, whether it be by router or by hand, I like to start with the mortises first. This way I can get a good starting point for my tenons. If I start with the tenons first, it's going to be a lot more difficult to perfectly fit the mortise, whereas if I start with the mortises first, it's a lot easier to perfectly fit the tenons. And with the mortises all plunged out, I could do a quick bit swap and start cutting the tenons. And those tenons are going to go on the top and bottom rails, while the stiles are the ones that got mortises. And the easiest way that I've found to remember that is that the rails run across the doors like railroad tracks across the country. It's not perfect, but it works. And if you like tips like that and you're enjoying this build, make sure you like and subscribe. It really helps the video out, and I greatly appreciate your support. So once I had confirmed that the fit on the tenons was perfect, I could go ahead and flip around my workpiece and cut the tenon on the other side. Now, just to cover all my bases, if I was cutting these tenons over at the table saw, I would just cut in my shoulders and cheeks on a test piece first, and then slowly raise the blade until I got the perfect fit. Thankfully, I don't have to do as much test fitting with the panther router, though it does still require some setup. Another option might just be to go with floating tenons or dominoes for this joinery, and that way you could avoid any errors altogether. But I've honestly learned so much from my mistakes that I'm thinking of making a few more. Now, to add more dimensionality to the doors, I'm going to go ahead and plane down the rails by a 1/16 of an inch. Here I'm just careful to keep all my boards oriented in the correct direction, because I like to have a continuous grain pattern for my top and bottom rails and my two stiles. This way the grain feels even on each door. From there I'll head over to the outfeed table and round over the inside edges. I did mark out the areas where the rails meet the stiles so that I didn't round over those sections. Instead, I'll just ease those transitions with a sanding block. This is another one of those features that's not really necessary, but adds a little bit more intrigue. Because honestly, even if I left these edges alone, the doors would probably turn out fantastic. But going that extra mile and giving the doors a round over on the interior ties in the doors to the rest of the piece since those curved edges are seen throughout. I think it's in details like these that make custom furniture stand out. So whenever you're approaching a piece on your own and you're thinking about what edge treatments to use, consider the story the rest of your project is telling. If you can tie in all those little elements, it's going to add up to a better cohesive design. I often talk about design within the projects, but I try not to sway your opinion one way or another because I firmly believe that design is subjective. We don't always have to agree on what is great design and what isn't, but we can all appreciate when someone's putting in the effort to try to make a statement, even if it's a statement we don't agree with. But let me know if you guys want to hear more about that kind of stuff down in the comments. If you want to hear more about my opinion on design throughout these videos, start your comment with design. If you don't and you just want to see the work, start your comment with work. I always try to take your feedback into consideration for future videos, so if you have an opinion one way or another, just let me know. And as always, if you start your comment with design or work, I'll reply to you guys first because I know you're paying attention. Alright, so let's get back to work on these designer doors. When gluing up the mortise and tenon joinery here, I just apply a little glue to the mortise and then squeeze everything nice and tight using some parallel clamps. From there I'll check everything for square, and 60% of the time, that works every time. From there, I can set up a rabbeting bit over at the router table. Now here I'm looking for these rabbets to be about 5/16 of an inch deep and 1/4 inch wide. And the reason I decided to go with that depth is because I want to leave enough room for the staples to not pierce through the front of the doors. Since I've already thinned out the upper and lower rails, I don't have a lot of wiggle room there. So trying to keep these as thick as possible is key to success. My caning is about 1/16 of an inch thick, so it's going to offset those staples by that much as well. So as long as I leave myself at least 1/4 inch material on the other side of the rabbet, then I should be okay. And don't worry if that doesn't make sense right this second, it will shortly. Next I needed to go ahead and clean up the corners left by the rounded bit. And to do that, I'll just use a chisel. Here I'm just careful to take nice easy controlled taps so I don't break through the rabbets and ruin the front of my doors. I guess it really is true what they say about control. You never realize how little self-control you have until they put chips and salsa down in front of you at the Mexican restaurant. Next I could go ahead and pop the doors in place so they can lay out the location for the hinge mortises. Now I like to just do this in a really simple way by using a 3-inch block and then just mark out the location on the top and bottom of the doors while I have the doors set in place. This avoids me having to do any math and trying to figure out any measurements because I know if I align the door mortises and hinges up with those locations that my doors are going to hang nicely. Then from there I can just head over to the drill press and use a Forstner bit to drive in my hinge cups. Now just like the drawer slides, I'm going to be using soft close hinges by Bloom for my doors. And these will also feature that same push to open functionality that the drawers do. But that additional feature comes from a push to open mechanism that I'll install in the cabinet later on. For now, these just get installed like regular European style hinges. So I'll first use a square to make sure that my hinge is square, and then I'll drill in a couple pilot holes and drive in my screws. Then from there I'll head over to the cabinet and I'll just use another square to mark out lines for the front edge of the top and bottom of the case. This will allow me to line up the doors based off the thickness of my material. From there, I just use a jig to locate my pilot hole locations, drill them out, and pop in the screws. Next, I can go ahead and pop the doors in place. Luckily, this set came together pretty easily and didn't require a lot of adjustments. But if there are more adjustments needed, you can just use a screwdriver to adjust the hinges or a hand plane to adjust the fit of the door. So with the doors hung, it was time to move on to the base. And the first step in that process is going to be milling down my 8/4 material. Now, since we've already milled down a ton of material in this video, I'm going to speed through this section so that we can get on to the more exciting parts of the base build. Because man, it's a doozy. So as you can see here, in this section, we're going to be working with some pretty chunky tree slices. And they really need to be for this project because that cabinet is a lot heavier than I anticipated. Which almost led me to go a different route with the base and definitely led to some sleepless nights. But we'll get into the why of that momentarily. For now, my focus was ripping down these slabs of tree into 3 2.5-inch beams. With the beams cut out for the stretchers and rails, I could go ahead and turn my focus to the feet. And I want the feet on this beast to be 2 inches thick, so I need to laminate up a pair of boards. Now, when it comes to laminations, unlike regular joinery, there's no such thing as too much glue. Here I want to have both a healthy amount of squeeze out and a healthy amount of clamps applied. This way I don't risk any gaps or pockets in the lamination. And with laminations, I also like to give them about 12 hours to set up, just so that I'm sure that everything's cured before milling it down. And when it comes to milling down laminations, I treat those basically the same as any regular board, with the one exception being that I try to keep the thickness of my thickest piece, so I aim to mill down the thinner side. Next, I could go ahead and trim all my base parts down to their final length. Now, when trimming pieces like this, it's important to use a consistent stop. Even if your stop is off by a 1/16 of an inch one way or another, you want to cut down all your same length parts at the same time. This way, if any of your settings are off slightly, all of your parts will be off slightly by the same margin. And I'd say the same thing is true when you're ripping pieces down to their final width. You don't want to move the fence at all during that process, because if you do, odds are you're not going to be able to nail that cut again. You may get pretty close, but it's better practice to just keep things as is. So with the base parts trimmed out, I could go ahead and start laying out the joinery. And for the joinery on the base, I'm going to be using floating tenons, which are probably better known as dominoes. And I decided to go that route with these parts rather than traditional mortise and tenon joinery, because the layout of the design I have for the base is kind of difficult. So with the design in mind, I wanted to make things as approachable as possible. And that's where the domino really shines. And that's because the slight offsets from one side to the other are a lot easier to execute when you have a tool that's repeatable like the domino. Once I set the fence on the domino, I can just plunge those mortises in all of my parts and know that they're going to align properly. That is, of course, as long as all my measurements are correct. Whereas if I tried to cut all those mortise and tenon joints by hand, there's a lot more room for error. It's kind of like that awkward moment when you're wearing Nikes and you just can't do it. So with the joinery in place, it was time to shape the stretchers. Try saying that 5 times fast. And to do that, I'll just use some dividers to find the negative space at the top of the stretcher. This slight offset is what's going to give the base a floating appearance, which just happens to be the part that probably stressed me out most about this base. I designed the case to sit above the legs, so all the pressure from the front and rear rails goes directly into the sides of the feet, which with the weight of the case had me a bit nervous. But after some heavy contemplation, I felt it was worth the risk. So with my workpieces marked out with my template, I could head back over to the bandsaw and do my best to stay just outside that line. Now I actually lucked out a bit here in that this diameter is almost exactly 1 1/4 inches, which happens to be exactly the diameter of one of my spindle sander sleeves. So I'll just use that to clean up all my concaved parts. The cool thing here is that not only does this clean up the parts, but it also ensures that all my shapes are exactly the same. So it also makes all the stretchers incredibly consistent without using any router templates. Next, it was time to mark out the really long curve for the front and rear rails of the base. Now, I don't have a template for this. Instead, I'm just going to use a thin piece of scrap and use a couple clamps to hold that in place while I mark out the curve. And at this point, I'm only going to mark out one of my beams. Once I have that trimmed out, I'll just use those lines as a guide to replicate it on the other one. And again here, I'll cut those out over at the bandsaw. Now, when I'm cutting really long, sweeping curves like this, my goal is to try to keep things as smooth as possible. I know pretty well that I'm not going to be perfect across this curve, but I try to be as close as I can. Then from there, I can clamp my 2 workpieces together and use my random orbit sander to smooth everything out. Basically here, I'm just trying to smooth out the high spots and even out my 2 edges. And once I have things nice and smooth in this orientation, I'll flip one of my beams around and smooth it out in the other. This way, everything should match up pretty closely. Now, obviously, this curve isn't going to be perfect cutting it this way, but it should pass the eyeball test, and that's what's most important. Then from there, I can take the beams over to the bench and hand plane off any saw marks remaining on the top side. Here, I'm just careful not to remove too much material since I already aligned my rails with that top edge. From there, I was on to plunging the holes for my mounting location on the stretchers. And to do that, I'm first going to start with a wider Forstner bit so that I have plenty of room to pop in a washer. This larger mortise goes about halfway through the stretcher, which allows me to use a shorter bolt when mounting the base. And plunging this deep also allows for concealing the hardware a bit better. Then from there, I'll swap in a 5/16 inch bit so that there's enough room for the 1/4 inch bolt to go through and have a little wiggle room in the hole. Keeping this hole slightly larger than my 1/4 inch bolt also allows for any wood expansion that may occur in the future. Then from there, I can head over to the router table and put a 1/4 inch round over on all my parts for the base. Now, I know it's pretty deep in the build at this point, but I completely forgot to say that if you guys want plans for this project, just let me know down in the comments, and as always, if there's enough interest, I'll put them together. Now, when rounding over all these parts, I paid close attention to how these joints were going to align, because there's some areas that I definitely don't want to round over where the joints meet up. Instead, I just marked those areas out and left a slight gap in the edge treatment. And I feel like that's a pretty good tip to emphasize because I've been bit by that one in the past. Whenever you are doing roundovers or edge treatments like this, it's a really good idea to make sure you mark things out clearly. You don't want to spend a few days working on a piece only to round over the wrong edge and ruin the overall look. So take your time and mark things out. So once I was as close as I was comfortable with those joints at the router table, I could take the workpiece back over to the bench and just use a rasp and a sanding block to clean those transitions up. Now I'll throw a bit of caution in here because if you go too far with the rasp, then it's going to be really difficult to fix it. So if you're not comfortable using a rasp in situations like this, just take your time with the sanding block and you'll get there eventually. You'll just get to the party a lot faster with a rasp, so sometimes you gotta risk it for the biscuit. Is that where the name comes from? Next, it was time for the first glue up of the base. And to make things a bit easier, I went ahead and pre-glued all my dominoes in place before doing the full assembly. This way my internal clock wasn't screaming at me the entire time. Then from there, I could go ahead and glue up the rails and stretchers. I decided to break this glue up into two parts just so that my clamps weren't battling each other and I had more room to work with. And once I had a nice amount of glue applied to each mortise, I could go ahead and do my best foosball impression to tighten things down. So while the glue dried, I could go ahead and turn my attention to the shelf pins for the outer cabinets. Now usually I use this jig for installing shelf pins, but since I'm using a curved front on my case, unfortunately my usual jig just won't work. So instead I just created another one using a scrap piece of plywood. Then from there I could plunge in all my shelf pin holes and slide in my shelves. Now I know we've had a big debate about shelf pins versus no shelf pins, but again, I think this is one of those situations where it calls for shelf pins because I don't know how big my receivers are going to be forever. So shelf pins for the win. With the stretchers and rails out of clamps, I could go ahead and glue on the feet. Again, this is why I broke the glue up into two different sections. Because if I had tried to do this all at one time, it'd be a lot more complicated to get these clamps on the feet, and with the rails and stretchers all assembled, it makes accessing those parts a lot easier. So the next step in the process was the finish. And for the finish on this piece, I'm going to be using my tried and true Rubio monocoat. Now, I just recently went over how I apply Rubio, so I'm not going to go into detail today. But it is one of my favorite finishes to use in the shop, and it's one I keep turning back to. So while I get that finished up, allow me to take a moment to say thank you to you guys for watching and supporting the channel. I design, build, and film all these pieces on nights and weekends, so having your support means a lot. And with that in mind, if you guys are enjoying the content you see on the channel and you want to support the show, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon. Your membership will gain you access to free monthly plans, access to the Discord channel where we're constantly chatting about woodworking and woodworking techniques, discount codes in the shop, and a lot more access that you just can't get through YouTube alone. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, check out the link down in the description. And as always, if you can't join today, no sweat, thank you for liking, commenting, and sharing the videos. And to those of you who have already joined, thank you so much for your continued support. Your donations go directly towards making these videos. So thank you. Alright, 7th inning stretch, let's go Sweet Caroline. So after about 24 hours of drying, I could come back in the shop, and since the cabinet was flipped over, I could go ahead and inlay my brand. And to do that, I'll just use a router and a template to carve out the inlay. From there, I'll scuff up the back and apply a little CA glue to my brand and then pop it in place. Next, it was on to mounting the base to the underside of the cabinet. So the first step there is just to get things aligned. And once I was happy with the fit and placement, I could go ahead and use the same 5/16 inch brad point bit that I drilled out the holes with to mark out the location for my threads on the underside of the case. Now, rather than threaded inserts, I'm actually going to be using wood-cut threads instead. Poet and didn't know it. So the first step there is to go ahead and drill in my pilot holes. And to make sure things stay perfectly 90, I'm just going to use a drill guide. From there, I'll just chuck in my wood tap and cut the threads. Now, it's important here to keep your drill in its lowest setting and stop when you hit the bottom of your hole. From there, just throw the drill in reverse and back it out slowly. Now, I actually prefer using woodcut threads when I can, but there are certain situations where threaded inserts are necessary. For this type of connection though, and many others, woodcut threads are plenty strong. You definitely don't have to worry about the cabinet falling off the base and toppling over. It's okay, I'm a limo driver. From there, I could go ahead and cut down the rear panel. Now, the rear panel in a lot of casework is super important because it really does a lot to prevent racking. And I've discussed that aspect many times in the past. For this piece, I'm not super worried about it because there's a lot of cross support in the center of the case, but it obviously does add a bit of structure. So once I have my measurements, I'll just trim it out using a track saw and then just drive a couple holes in the back so that my cords have an escape route. Just be careful wielding a massive bit like this by hand, because if you don't hold the bit at just about 90 degrees, you're going to get a ton of tear out and you're probably going to ruin your panel. From there, I was finally on to the caning. So here I went ahead and trimmed my cane down to an oversized piece and then left it to soak in some warm water in the bath for about an hour. Doing that allows for the cane to soak up some water and loosen up a bit. This way when it dries, it'll tighten back up and it'll give you a tight door front. From there, I'll just pop in a 1/4-inch staple into every other section. Here, you just want to be careful to keep everything as aligned as you can so that you don't have a sideways pattern. From there, I'll just use a utility knife to trim away the excess. Now, when you're done tacking the caning in place, you're going to have a pretty rough looking rear side of the door. So to cover that up, I'm just going to cut out a few strips to conceal those rough edges. Now, this isn't 100% necessary to do, but I'm more of a fan of the finished look, so I'm going to go ahead and take this extra step. So all I'm going to do is apply a thin layer of CA glue and some activator to pop these guys in place. At this point, they're all going to sit a bit proud, but I'll clean those strips up using a block plane and a random orbit sander. Once I have everything flat and secure, I can go ahead and apply a bit more finish at the backside and pop the doors in place. Now, normally at the end of a project, I come in with a bunch of glamour shots and show you guys the finished product. But I'm going to do something slightly different with this one and show you guys a condensed version. So if you want to see a more in-depth look and overview of the final piece, all you have to do is visit my Patreon page to get a deep dive, and access to that content will be absolutely free. So with that said, if you want a more detailed look, check out Patreon. But for now, here's the trailer. I absolutely love how this long and low media console turned out. It ticks just about every box for me, from the design to the style and the overall look. The half-round drawer fronts and dovetailed drawer boxes turned out awesome, and the caned doors and floating base turned out fantastic. So if you want to see more builds like this one, check out this video next. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and as always, I knew this would work, and I'll see you next time.